From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump wins a dust-up with Colombia over military planes for deportation flights. Meantime, the CIA says in a new assessment, albeit with low confidence, that the COVID virus most likely originated in a lab with Wuhan, China. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. The diplomatic incident that was launched and then settled in a day on Sunday began when Colombian President Gustavo Petro revoked the authority to land for two U.S. C-117 military planes, each carrying about 80 migrants that were being repatriated to Colombia. Petro said that he was protesting the use of military aircraft as well as handcuffs, saying we will receive our countrymen on commercial planes without them being treated like criminals. That led President Trump to elevate this to Truth Social, promising that unless the Colombian government backed down, there would be emergency 25% tariffs on all Colombian goods coming into the United States, going to 50% within a week, as well as enhanced border inspections for Colombian nationals, cargo, treasury, banking, financial sanctions, and more. The end result was that Colombia did back down. Kim, those repatriation flights using military aircraft seem to be back on. What do you make of this as a use of the president's diplomatic powers abroad?
I think that this was entirely to be expected. It still kind of slays me that 8 years now, Donald Trump has been on the scene, and people sometimes still struggle to understand his modus operandi, how he works. And the way to think about him is he is not just a businessman and a deal maker, but as part of that, he's all about taking tough positions to get what he wants. And he realized, I think, during the course of his first term, the potential power of threatening tariffs on other countries. I have to be honest, I don't necessarily think it is the thing he would most like to do. I think he does have an understanding of the economic peril and problems of times of tariffs, but he's never going to let anybody know that. And his power is in letting people know that he wouldn't be afraid to do it. I think that's what's behind his claims that tariffs are beautiful things. He wants people to believe that he's going to pull the pin if that's what he intends to do, and if you don't come to the table to deal with him. So in this case, in his mind, Donald Trump's mind, this is a pretty straightforward point. We already had, I should note, a lot of deportation flights going back to Colombia. Under the Biden administration, there had been 8 in January alone. There have been more than 90 deportation flights in general, returning people to their countries of origin. And Trump was essentially doing the same. President Petro decided that he was going to try to make a stand on this and found out very quickly the economic potential consequences that would come if Trump did decide to go down this road.
The imbalance might be part of why Trump got the result that he did and so quickly. According to some of the reporting, the U.S. takes about 28% of Colombia's total exports, including flowers and coffee. And so its ability, even though President Petro at one point was suggesting that he would retaliate with tariffs, his ability to cause similar sort of damage to the United States economy, which is massive compared to Colombia's, is pretty small. And so, Bill, I guess what's your take here? And it does seem like an instance of Trump using tariffs as a negotiating leverage, as a threat. On the other hand, there are also places where Trump seems to think that tariffs are good in themselves. He's talked about across-the-board tariffs. He's talked about tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And, Bill, those are countries where the trade is more balanced. And so if Canada wanted to retaliate on U.S. goods, U.S. exports, it would have a much better way to do that than Colombia does, I think.
Yeah, I'll take it in two parts. The first part is I think Trump succeeded because the imbalance was so great. I agree with Kim on that. Colombia almost provided a great example for Trump to show what he can get, precisely because it is much smaller. And the plain fact is Colombia needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs Colombia. So Trump was able to threaten, and the threat was so big down in Colombia that they had to back down, and he got his way. And that confirms the point that Trump sees tariffs as a negotiating pressure point to apply the threat. But the second point that you're making, President Trump has given different rationales at different times for tariffs. On the one hand, he said it's a good negotiating ploy, and you saw at this time that worked to his advantage. The threat can be decisive in some way, even against bigger countries where the U.S. would absorb. Very few countries want to take that chance that they're going to trigger this. He's also mentioned it, as you alluded to, as kind of a way to rebalance trade and keep jobs in America, just as for the American worker. And the third way, he's also talked about it as a great revenue enhancer. He seems to think that it's free. There are no costs to it. So there are all three of those. We're skeptical of tariffs, I think, for good reason, but this is not going to dissuade him from using it in the future.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. My other concern here, Kim, is whether it is another example of Trump maybe being harder on friends and allies sometimes than he is on enemies. The way that he went about this on Truth Social was almost going to DEFCON 1 over what could have been, in another administration, a pretty minor diplomatic disagreement about whether you use a military jet or a commercial jet to make these repatriation flights. And particularly given that part of what Trump wants to do in decoupling from China, it seems to me, is get manufacturers to nearshore maybe. There's a U.S. trade agreement, free trade agreement with Colombia. And so a business might think, okay, I'm going to get out of China. I'm going to go find some place closer to the U.S. to do some of my manufacturing. Maybe I'm not going to do it all in the U.S., some in the U.S., some will do in Colombia. And the idea that despite this free trade agreement, that the United States president, with a Truth Social post on the internet, can potentially tomorrow put 25 or 50% tariffs on that business arrangement that the company has made carefully, spending lots of money, putting lots of investment in, is a potential problem, I think.
I'd take a slightly different view of this. It is true that historically Colombia has been our ally. We do have this free trade agreement in there, but a lot of things have happened in Colombia in recent years. And I was really struck that most of the media just completely ignored this context. It was fascinating. Petro, in the words of our colleague Mary Anastasia O'Grady, is a former terrorist and a socialist who has been working very hard in Colombia to turn that country into a satellite of Venezuela and Cuba. And I don't think that there's any way you can look at this spat and not understand that there was an element of politics involved here. The Colombian president was clearly trying to get some props in that world, socialist world, by standing up to the right-wing Donald Trump, American, dictator. And, I would note that one of the things that he said in this spat, and by the way, that online social media spat was begun by Petro, not by Trump. He lobbed the first volley there and decided to turn this into a social media phenomenon rather than a backroom diplomatic deal. But he ultimately wrote, the solution to illegal immigration is not simply to deport people and criminalize them. It's to realize the real causes of migration. It is to act on the real causes of migration, the wealth gap and the causes of Latin American poverty, at which point he then went into a little thing about removing Latin American debt. So there's a lot going on here that didn't necessarily have to do. And as I noted, we were already deporting people to Colombia. And in fact, a lot of jets are headed out to a lot of other countries, and it didn't roll this way. So I do see your point, Kyle, too, about nearshoring, although the reality is a lot of capital has in fact been fleeing Colombia in recent years, given Petro's new control over the country, as American and Western investors fear for the future of that country. Now, could that be a problem for companies that have been nearshoring, for instance, in Mexico and some of our more indisputed and larger trading partners? Yes, and that is something that Trump team is going to have to think about very closely before they try something like this again. But my point being, I'm not not sure a lot of other countries would have tried a stunt like this.
Bill, I take the points that Kim makes there about the domestic political situation, Petro picking this fight and going to social media himself and probably playing to his domestic base there. On the other hand, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that I worry that we're in a competition with China, and there are, for other countries, third-party countries, often they are trying to figure out which of these alliances they're going to align with. And I worry that this kind of thing potentially, and you can add in Trump's threats to Panama, Trump's statements about Greenland and Denmark, gives China an opening to come into maybe the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, South America, and increase their own influence and suggest that we can be a more reliable and a less erratic ally for you than the United States right now.
Yeah, I think that's a real threat, but let's look at the facts. China is not a good partner, and a lot of countries, including in Latin America, are worried about Chinese investment comes down and takes over strategic industries like the ports and so forth, and they get into Chinese control, and that's a big concern among a lot of countries. So as erratic as America is, I think most people would prefer American markets and to be within the broad American alliance. Again, I think this also shows that Kim mentioned that Colombia started this, and Trump realized Colombia is a pretty good case to try his theory on because the costs are lower than other places. There's all this domestic upheaval and anti-Americanism. And I think the mistake the president of Colombia made was trying to out-Trump Trump. They're not going to do it. And I think Trump, I assume he was cagey, and he recognized that because it was small, because the trade was limited and very lopsided, this is a textbook case with not a lot of downside and a lot of potential upside for him. So again, he got the win, right? The question is, as I think is what you're implying, my fear about using tariffs as a threat, it's like mutual assured destruction. It works until the day it doesn't. And to keep it a threat, he does have to impose it. He'll have to impose this sooner or later on someone if it's going to remain a real threat.